this is the backdrop of these different grass species that I did the illustrations of in order to complete the book, the Grasses of East Africa. And I'll start off by telling you a little bit about the journey into, doing this book and learning and writing about grasses. I grew up in Western Kenya. Western Kenya is a fairly rural part of Kenya, in a farming community where we were surrounded by nature. I was very lucky to grow up without a television at home. So I would, after school, had to spend all my time looking at insects, looking at plants and birds and other animals. That was my way of keeping myself busy and entertained. And coming from a community that was very embedded with nature, from an early age, I learned something very interesting, that we as humans have this remarkable ability to identify and to classify and to look and actually see the details of living things around us. And this is a really important part of being human. And it's a very important part for many, many people across the continent who still live very connected with nature. And so in today's talk, I'm going to go back and forth between time and space, but give you a nice overview, I hope, of what is a very important group of plants, talk a little bit about their role in ecology and evolution, but really talk about where they fit into the bigger picture of our economy, of our societies, of our future, of our livelihoods across the continent. Here is one of my favorite places in the world. This is up in northern Kenya. And here are some of the amazing people that are part of this landscape. This is a women's group in northern Kenya. And you can see what they're holding up, what they've just harvested are some of these grasses. This in particular is Abyssinian Rhodes grass. And it's a very important grass for pasture, for hay, for seed production in many different parts of the world. But this is a beautiful scene. This is after there's been, good rains in this part of Kenya. But this is an unusual scene also, because what's happening here is actually this grass is not wild grass. It has been cultivated and managed for the harvest of seeds. For those of you who are familiar with this part of the world, you will have heard about the drought we've been under. For the last almost 3 years now, we have had 5 failed rainy seasons. And many communities across the Horn of Africa are really, really struggling to survive. Over 4 million Kenyans in my country alone are facing hunger, and there's a need for the government and international agencies to provide food. And yet at the same time, these landscapes are also places where many communities have lived for thousands and thousands of years, have actually been inhabited by humans and human ancestors for millions of years. And the habitats that we have been part of, both recently as well as through time, have been these grasslands and savannas. So this scene here, the women's group are harvesting the grass because they've actually planted it. They planted it when there was a little bit of good rain. And the remarkable thing is that despite the lack of rain, despite the drought, despite all the other stresses that are happening in this landscape, they were able, without the input of any fertilizers, without any additional inputs that cost more money, they were able, from a small area of land, from 20 acres, to produce thousands and thousands of bales of hay, and also many hundreds of kilos of seed of grass. And so today we're going to look at this amazing ecosystem. We'll talk a little bit about how it's evolved and its importance, but I'll share a few examples of both how grasses and grasslands are connected to human life and livelihoods, as well as all the other species that are part of them and how they are becoming more and more important, how fragile they are in today's world. So this particular women's group are one of many different groups across the continent We often hear of the situation around issues about food security. We hear about the droughts that have been very serious. We hear about many of the problems, but one of the things I want to personally highlight and communicate is the many good things that are happening here in the continent. Across East Africa, we have many communities that are taking charge of their land, that are actually engaging in a more ecological approach, that are figuring out livelihoods, that are adapting to difficult situations, and that are resilient and actually have been resilient for some time. Most of them are doing it at a small scale, but there's great potential to scale it up and to do it at a much bigger scale across the whole continent. So this is one of just many women's groups that I've had the great pleasure of working with and learning from, and learning that actually how grasslands establish all these different species that interact, how we can actually have productivity for human societies, and we can also restore the ecology around us and make it functional. So from this beautiful scene in northern Kenya, I'll talk a little bit about grasslands and production systems across the continent, and then we'll go through a few examples for you to engage with and learn from. So here's a map of Africa that shows you the different kind of climate, ecology, and land use systems. And from this, you will see that most of the continent, as was pointed out in the very lovely introduction, most of the continent is dry and arid or semi-arid. We do have wonderful areas of forest, but when you think of Africa, you think of this landscape here in the background. This is the Serengeti Plains in northern Tanzania. And these grasslands have come about over the last sort of many millions of years, but one particular point in time was the shift sort of in the Miocene period, which was sort of between 5 and 35 million years ago, when the climate of Africa started progressively getting drier. So you look at my country here, Kenya, and today Kenya has almost 80 or even up to 90% of the country is classified as arid or semi-arid. So to survive in that kind of landscape takes a very particular kind of ecology, and they're very unique species of plants and animals. But it is actually, despite being a harsh seasonal landscape, it's also a landscape that is filled or was filled with wildlife and can actually support an amazing, remarkable number of living things. So if we look across the continent, typically what has happened is in these drier areas from the Sahel all the way through the Horn of Africa into most of East Africa, to northern Kenya and eastern and southern Kenya, northern Uganda, large parts of Tanzania, and further down south into the bulk of the Southern African zone. Before we established a lot of agriculture, people were pastoralists, and pastoralism and keeping of animals goes back much further in time than agriculture, which is a much more recent establishment, both within the continent as well as more broadly as something that humans have done. So if we also look at these systems today, we think about my own country, Kenya. Where are the issues that we have within the country? Well, the north and the arid lands, the rangelands as we call them, are the places where there's also a lot of conflict. So communities in these areas, which used to be called or are still called marginal areas, face a huge number of challenges in terms of livelihoods and food security. But now with climate change, we're seeing a lot more conflict. And so one of the real tragedies of climate change is that in these areas, these rangelands where people have lived with livestock for thousands of years, we are seeing that way of life being very challenged and really causing a lot of problems. And underlying the social problems, the economic problems, the political and security problems are ecological issues. And as an environmental biologist, as an evolutionary biologist, I always look to nature to try and see what can we learn from that to help answer and change the world around us. So I want to start by showing you an animal everyone will be familiar with who's watching. This is a lioness. She's sitting out in the beautiful part of Kenya, resting on the grass. She's had, she's hunted and provided for her family. And lions are one of these iconic animals. They're such an iconic animal for us in Africa. Whenever you see people here going to the national park in Kenya, they will ask you, where are the lions? I want to see the lions. And the lion is an animal that's very interesting if we think about its history and where they are today. Well, today there's only about 25,000 lions left in the whole world, and most of those are in Africa. And the largest number of that African population are actually in Kenya and Tanzania. Kenya has over 2,000 lions. Tanzania has probably between 10 and 15,000, and the rest of the lions are distributed across the continent in southern Africa. There's a small population of lions that occur in India in the Gir forest, but the lion really today as a species is an African species, and it's one of the most iconic animals. Now, most people, when they go on safari, they'll take a picture of a lion like this beautiful one here lying in the grassland. But what they don't realize is where she's lying down, there's also dozens of species of grass. We can see some of the red oat grass, the Themida, here in the background. Here in the foreground, we've got Sporophyllus, we have an Aristida, we have some Pennisetum, at least 2 Pennisetum species. There's a Citeria. So when you learn about biodiversity, what it teaches you is to look at the world and to see details. But one of the tragic things about plants is that many people, including biologists, suffer from something we call plant blindness. So they will look at a landscape, they will look at the animals, they'll see how magnificent they are, but they will fail to see the plants, to see that this lioness and her family could not survive in this landscape if it wasn't for this amazing complex grassland. And that in this grassland are not just the grasses themselves, over 100 species in this particular area, but also many different species of birds, of insects, of fungi. And what we see above ground is but just a tiny fraction of the life and the energy and the interactions. Most of it is actually happening below the ground. And so more than 9/10, 90% of the biomass of these grasses is actually below the ground in the soil, supporting this robust and healthy ecosystem that is then able to support many different species of animals that feed on the grasses and animals that feed on the animals that feed on the grasses, like our lioness. In order to effectively conserve lions in the future, they're one of our iconic species, but they are an endangered species. We are going to need to look after habitats as well as look after and conserve these animals. And as conservationists, as people who care about our heritage, it's really, really important that we all learn to understand and connect the actual species that we see, that we love so much, and the interactions in the ecosystem. That's really why I did the book on grasses, was to get people to really see the details of nature and understand that those details are so very connected to everything else that we care about and that we need to conserve. Now, here is another scene from East Africa that will be familiar to many of you who've watched nature documentaries, who've traveled, maybe gone on safari. Here is the wildebeest migrating through the Serengeti. And one of the most spectacular migrations occurs here in East Africa. We have these wildebeest, and they migrate between the Serengeti and the Mara in Kenya. You will have heard from the documentaries, over 1 million wildebeest on the move. But the wildebeest is a very interesting species, and they also tell us something about grasslands. Now, first of all, wildebeest actually evolved in southern Africa, in grassland ecosystems there, and then have spread north through the continent. There are multiple wildebeest species, and many of them, including here in East Africa, were involved in these migrations. So why do these animals migrate, and how are they migrating? Well, First of all, we have to remember these are very seasonal ecosystems. So you have wet seasons and dry seasons. Here near the equator, things are a little bit different from South Africa in that the intertropical convergence zone crosses the equator twice. It goes north with the temperate movement north of spring, peaking with the summer. And then it shifts and goes south and then comes south to the southern hemisphere, which is when you have the summer in southern Africa and the rainfall. So we get 2 rainy seasons. And that's because of this twice of the crossing of the equator by this zone. But the rains then come as a result of this activity with the monsoonal system of the Indian Ocean. And this pulsing in these ecosystems has been very important and has been part of the evolution of these incredible savannas and the migration of animals within them. So the wildebeest basically follow the seasons, looking for better pasture. And they are one of these remarkable species because if we had come to this part of the world over 100 years ago, we would have discovered that there weren't that many wildebeest. And how would that have happened? Had they been hunted? No, well, not so much. Well, they had been dying, and they were dying from a disease called rinderpest. And so over 100 years ago, the wildebeest, together with many, many, many other species across the continent, both livestock and wildlife, died in very large numbers because rinderpest had entered the continent. They think it came from the Middle East or from trade across the ocean, and it entered the continent, it spread through the continent, and here in East Africa, it devastated the wildlife and the livestock. At the same time, in the late 1800s, we had smallpox, another disease, another virus that spread through these landscapes and devastated people. At this time, the early colonial enterprise was getting going, and many of the communities that existed here would have been able to resist had they not both suffered diseases and lost a lot of their livelihoods and source of nutrition through the loss of their herds. But since then, since the late 1800s, the remarkable thing with wildebeest is their numbers have been steadily increasing over that century, the last century, until recently. Wildebeest numbers now are actually starting to decrease again. And due to many different issues, from drought to land use change to other challenges to their movement, infrastructure development, and other things actually disrupting the migratory routes, we're starting to see wildebeest numbers go back down. So of the 1.2 million wildebeest, the famous wildebeest of the Serengeti and the Mara, about half of those would cross into Kenya in an average year. But now even far fewer are crossing. And if we don't figure out what's happening with this remarkable spectacle of migration and these amazing ecosystems, we will face the prospect of losing these migrations, and many other large animal migrations have collapsed across the world. And this is one of the few that still continues, the wildebeest in the Serengeti. And the movement is really related to the growth and the change in grasslands. The wildebeest themselves are very important as ecosystem engineers. There's a whole succession of species moving through the grasslands. As they kick the grass open, as they trample it, it actually stimulates more growth. They follow groups of zebras, so the zebras go in and they're much more like horses grazing on the rougher parts of the grass, the hay, opening it up for more growth, which is better for wildebeest and for other species, including for cattle. So typically the pastoralists avoid the wildebeest with the cattle because the wildebeest carry when they calve, there's a disease that goes into the cattle that causes huge problems for them. But now, as there's more pressure on all of these landscapes, wildebeest, people, cattle, and changes in grassland, changes in climate are a real challenge. And if we're going to figure this out, if we're going to keep this spectacular migration going that's earning East Africa, many, many tens of millions of dollars, we really need to think about the ecosystem that underlies it. So I'm going to jump to another group here because it's one of my favorite animals and one of the most despised creatures in the world. For those of you who read the Bible, you will see the many, many mentions of this wonderful animal, who's much maligned from biblical times till today. This is the desert locust. And the desert locust is one of many locust species that occur across dry lands and rangelands that occur across Africa. There are locusts in Madagascar, they're in the Middle East, into parts of Asia, into Central Asia. And they also, like the wildebeest and like other species, have this really remarkable life history. There are locusts like this one that can form huge swarms. And if we remember the plagues that were set upon Egypt as as punishment in the biblical story, one of them was locusts. And locusts are these remarkable animals that when they switch on due to the changes in their ecosystem and become swarms. So normal locusts just live in the deserts. They live very happy lives. They're sort of getting along with each other, and they don't do anything very remarkable. But something happens in these desert ecosystems when there's the addition of just one ingredient, and that ingredient is water. When there's extra rainfall, you will see switches occurring where larger and larger numbers of locusts will breed and lay eggs, and they will actually undergo a biological change from a solitary to become a gregarious, a highly social insect. Now the swarms start moving. And a few years ago, after an absence of many decades, locusts entered the Horn of Africa. And they came and flew around my house, and you can see my little Jack Russell terrier down here, who's called Dudu. Dudu means insect in Swahili, was delighted because she found the locusts were extremely tasty snacks to eat, as did the mongoose and the hornbills, and many of the other animals were delighted to see the locusts arriving. However, of course, the governments were very concerned, and the immediate response was to spray the locusts with pesticides. There's a whole agency, a UN agency, that's dedicated to this. But I was trying to take a more ecological approach, and I said, look, let's think about the locusts as swarms. How do they behave? How do they travel? Can we understand that? Sorry, I think I just was unmuted. Can everyone hear me still?
Yes, we can hear you again. Thanks, Dino.
All right, thank you. So I said about the locusts, what we should do is really think about them as a source of this incredible biomass in these grasslands. And so one of the projects I advised did start turning locusts into feed for chickens and for fish. People do eat locusts as well in many parts of East Africa. And it really is a part of this change that's occurring in these grasslands. And because we'd had so much extra rain that particular year, we did not suffer as much from these locusts. But the way we responded with pesticides and chemicals, well, that's that's for another day. So here is another group of creatures that are parts of the grassland and savanna that are really important. And these are the termites. So when we go out into an ecosystem and we look at a savanna, we often don't think about what's going on below the ground. But grasslands are these incredible habitats where there has to be a lot of movement. It's a very dynamic system. There's a movement, a cycle of nutrients, a cycle of carbon, of nitrogen, of all these other things that are very important to the health and productivity of both the grasses themselves, as well as all the other species in this ecosystem. And termites are one of these overlooked, again, much maligned, but very, very important groups. So what the termites, like the locusts as well, do is they feed on plant matter. But termites take it a step further. Locusts are eating a lot of plant matter and producing a lot of what we call frass, basically locust poo, that goes into grasslands and actually helps build up the soil. Termites are taking it another step further. Not only are they breaking down plant matter, they are also able to break down the parts of the plant matter, the cellulose and other very hard tissues that most things cannot digest. They are doing that in partnership with fungi, with protozoa, and termite mounds across East Africa are these hot spots of nutrients that leach back into the soil and the ecosystem. And plants that grow around termite mounds are higher in nutrients and will often attract grazers. The other thing that termites do in this ecosystem is they actually change the structure, physically change the structure of the land. So again, another group of ecosystem engineers. And by changing that structure, they create both a better opportunity for themselves and their mounds, and also for many, many other species to live and interact and benefit from. One other remarkable discovery about termite mounds that has come about recently is how old they are. So some of these species of termites have a system where they can replace the queen. And there are individual mounds that have been proposed to actually live for not just hundreds, but actually thousands and thousands of years. Really amazing to think about a mound as thousands of years old, contributing nutrients, playing this role in an ecosystem. So here is a scene from a different part of Kenya. This is up in northern Kenya in Turkana, where our institute is based. It's a very famous place called Lothagam, because many important fossil discoveries have been made here. But what is unusual is this particular year we had extra good rains, and this habitat, which doesn't have typically a lot of grass, actually produced all these grasses, and they flowered. And so the other amazing thing about grasses and grasslands is how resilient they can be in different places. So this scene had not been this way for over a decade. No one had seen so much vegetation, and then with good rain, it was able to change. But most of Turkana, most of northern Kenya and the Horn of Africa is very arid, it's very degraded, and the rangelands are really facing a lot of challenges. But I want to show you one example from the Turkana South Turkwell Desert, which today is considered a desert. And you can see the site here. Site B shows you what most of this landscape is, but site A is this little bit of grassland that's within this amazingly dry ecosystem. Now, what is amazing to learn is this site A is actually a research plot that was established over 50 years ago, has been protected by this gentleman, an old man from the community who lives there. And this is actually what this entire arid ecosystem used to look like. And over the last few decades, due to the change in climate, the increase in livestock, land degradation, overgrazing, all of these different things combining, most of that ecosystem has shifted and is very different looking, but this is what it could look like. What is remarkable about this site, in addition to having the grasses, is that the temperatures here get very, very high. So there are many days where it is over 50 degrees Celsius. There are even places here where it gets to 60 degrees Celsius. There's even a site in Turkana that gets to 70 degrees Celsius. In all of those sites, there are insects and plants and other creatures living. As we face a hotter, more challenged future, these kinds of sites, the genes in these animals, the adaptations in these plants are going to be critical to our survival and ability to adapt. So I'm quickly going to tell you about just a couple of plants that I've worked on, a couple of grasses, and a little bit of interesting history around them. So buffel grass, Cenchrus, which is also called African foxtail grass, is one of the most common grasses across the continent. But if any of you have had the chance to visit the United States, the state of Texas, and enjoyed a steak in Texas, as Texas is very famous for its steak, you would have eaten a steak from a cow that fed on buffel grass. And how did this buffel grass go from Turkana to Texas? Well, many years ago, there was a Grasslands research station that looked at the grasses in East Africa and saw that they could support some of the most incredible animal biomass and diversity, including the largest of the herbivores, the elephant. And these grasses were taken from Kenya to Texas and to other parts of the world. The same thing happened in Southern Africa. Grasses were taken to many different parts of the world. Those grasses now in Texas are really important. for the livestock industry, but also causing issues around the ecology. Some of them have gone on to become invasive species. So when the grasses were moved, one of the things that wasn't really understood at the time, since this was 100 years ago, was the role of fungi and all these other insects and things that are involved in the grassland. So what we're doing now is a study paired between Texas and Kenya and looking at the dynamics, because we can think about this as a great natural experiment. Here is a transplant that occurred 100 years ago, but did not take all the microbiome of other things along with it, did not take all the fungi, all the endophytes, all the insects. So we can see how it's done after 100 years there, and we can compare it with Kenya, which we're doing right now. And the remarkable thing is at this one site in Kenya, where we have over 500 higher plant species, we have sequenced the endophytic fungi, and we found over 500 different kinds of fungi living just in this one grass. So it completely changes our perspective on diversity. So I wanted to tell you a little bit before I end here and take questions about the writing of the book. I'm a Kenyan who grew up in a rural area. I was very lucky to get a scholarship to Indiana University, later on to Harvard, where I got my PhD. And in order to write this book, I had to gather information from many different places, from the communities that I worked with, from my own observations as a naturalist over 20 years, but I also got to use herbaria. And herbaria and museums are really important resources. And one of the herbarium that I was able to use was in Kew in London. This is in Kew, and to go through these specimens. And as I was going through the specimens and making all my notes and working through different drafts of the book, it was very interesting because I encountered some specimens. This is a Crackney racemosa, a beautiful grass that had been collected by a very dear friend of mine and a botanist in East Africa called Anne Robertson. Anne Robertson is a botanist who's lived here and worked in Kenya and Tanzania for many, many decades. She's in her 80s at the moment. And I was going through the specimens and I realized Anne had collected some grasses that had gone into the herbarium that I, despite working for 20 years in the field in northern Kenya, had actually never seen. And so today, one of the real issues we're facing, we know, is extinction and the loss of biodiversity. But this is not just happening to big animals. Grasses and many plants are also facing threats. And we often don't notice that they're disappearing, because an average grassland in the plains or savannas of East Africa should have about 100 species. But recent surveys are struggling to find even half, 40 or 50 species in these grasslands. What exactly is changing? Is it the way we're impacting them? Is it something else? We really need to figure this out if we're going to protect these species. But I do want to point out that this kind of science and answering these questions, we stand on the shoulders of others, people like Anne, who've been a wonderful resource for many years for young scientists now can benefit from what others have done in the past. And I encourage all the students joining today to go and learn from your elders, learn from your communities, because that's as much an important lesson in science as it is learning from the specimens and the books and the lectures and the more formal side of things. This is my last slide before I take questions. And I wanted to show here this picture. I took it not so long ago flying back from northern Kenya. This is a traditional homestead, which has been abandoned. And what you can also see here is this extreme erosion that's occurring across this landscape. So over the last few years in Kenya, we've had this drought. We've now have rain starting to come back. The prediction is that we're going to switch from a very dry period to a very wet period with the El Nino, which means extra rain for East Africa, drought actually in other parts of the continent, including in parts of Southern Africa. So we're moving from one extreme to another. In the last decade, we have had 4 major droughts. Each of those droughts has seen a more collapse of the ecosystem, more degradation, more death of livestock and wildlife, and more stress on people and their livelihoods. Looking at this picture, this is a culture that has lived and survived in these harsh ecosystems for many, many thousands of years. But the big question now is, will it survive into the future? And what can we learn? What can we learn as a lesson from grasses, from the most humble plants that we constantly trample under our feet? What can we learn from them that will help us address these bigger questions? So I haven't answered it yet, but I believe that all of us can work together to do that. So thank you, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dino. I think you really did what you say, where you're opening our eyes to the finer details of nature. And I just want to read, before we do the poll, I want to read Dr. Ogilvy's comment, which says, "Thank you, Dr. Martins. You are an amazing presenter and very knowledgeable." She hopes the students have their pencils out, because a short pencil is better than a long memory.
Dr. Martins, I've done vegetation surveys for many years, and then I swung over to social ecology. And today you just brought back all those memories again and said, geez, why did I swing over to social ecology? But I also realized there's a balance there. But my students were online today, and I think they learned a hell of a lot. And I enjoy doing vegetation surveys, but also enjoy working with people. And I can see the importance, and I know the importance of locusts, and I know the importance of termites. And I just hope my students realize that now, that everything goes hand in hand. Without one, you can't have the other. But thank you so much. And I'm so glad I linked on. I'm jumping between DFFE's presentations and yours, because one of my colleagues had a little bit of a clash in his schedule. So thank you. Thank you very much. And geez, I see my students' hands are up, and I see Azzy has really started to ask a lot of questions, and they're very good questions. So thank you from our side.
Thank you so much.
So Dr. Dino, I'm going to ask, Dr. Shuttle said Azzy, so Asima. I see you have 2 questions in the chat, but I think maybe you should ask them yourself. Oh, you're gone. Okay, I see in the meantime, Holly Magog. Good morning.
Hi, Dino, thank you very much. We've all been watching here, and we have Gital who knows you very well and has been to a couple of your talks. Dino, we had a speaker on one of our past talks who is working with regenerative agriculture in Southern Africa. And he spoke about an observation they made, but that no one's ever done any studies on, what he called locust manure. So he noticed on his grasslands that anywhere where the locusts had been sprayed and then died, their bodies remained on the top of the ground and the grasses didn't regenerate. Anywhere where the locusts died naturally, the bodies were pulled down under the earth by different organisms, and there was this incredible rejuvenation of grasslands. But I even had a look myself. Do you know if there's been any studies on that, or why we as the Kenya government, and I mean, this whole locust spraying upset us, all us bird people, hugely. How can we communicate to policy the critical nature of locusts, even for the diet of local people?
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. No, locusts and grasshoppers, so even apart from the ones that are swarming, they naturally occur in our grasslands. And if we go to a grassland in Turkana, we will find the biomass of locusts in Turkana is even today double that of the goats and sheep. If you go to the Serengeti, you will find that there's an average of between 10 to 20 tons of locusts per square kilometer, eating 5 times their weight every day, so 100 tons of vegetation per square kilometer, and processing all that and producing all that locust frass, building up the soil. So most of the locusts and grasshoppers are actually a very important part. They're a keystone species, processing all this plant matter, returning it into the soil, interacting with lots of different microbes, being themselves a source of food for birds and for many other species. So they're part of that dynamic system, pumping nutrients and energy into different places. when we spray and kill them, we break that cycle. And really part of restoration really needs to take into account this new way of thinking. It's been in existence for millions of years, but we need to understand it better. Very interestingly, just a few days ago, I went to a thing that was a group of students graduating from West Pokot, and they're working on grassland restoration. And I'd given a talk about grasses earlier. And they were able to show me they're growing grass, actually Rhodes grass, for hay, for fodder production. But in the plots that they treated with natural manure and compost, and it had insects in, which cost them $2 per acre to do. They had, in 7 weeks, they had chest-high grass. In the plots that they were doing, they were following the official advice with fertilizers and pesticides costing over $200 an acre. They didn't even have half the growth that the natural ecosystem kind of managed this place had. So it's a very important thing for us to continue to do.
But Dino, if those are such stark, we can see those results, they're so stark. How are we not communicating that to policymakers? Where is the role for these students in this classroom today that are all here? What role can they play in that critical step of connecting science to policy?
So I think several things is, first of all, to learn the details. The details really matter. Go and learn, and learning in the field is just as important as learning in the classroom. So I'm sure Professor Ogilvie takes her students into the field. That's so critical, because seeing is a very deep part of learning as humans, and learning socially with each other is so important. So it's wonderful that we can connect virtually, but it's important they go and learn. And then 2 is to take that knowledge back to their families, their communities. And I've been, very inspired by people who've read the books I've written and said, I changed what I was doing on my farm because I learned about this. And I think that's, if many individual farmers and rangeland managers and pastoralists and conservancies can make simple changes, then it adds up to a much bigger change. I wouldn't expect government to come in and lead all of that change. We can make the change ourselves.
Thank you, Dino.
Thanks, Holly and Gitao.
I'm going to read the 2 questions that she asked. Her first one, Dr. Dino, is that locusts spread diseases such as cankers and root collar rot, and they breed really quickly. The question is, would this not be problematic and resulting in us losing our plants?
So locusts can be both part of the ecosystem, and also they can be pests. And that doesn't mean we can't manage them cleverly. One of the solutions to locusts is actually looking at the diseases that locusts themselves suffer from. And there are control methods, there are biopesticides, there are fungal compounds that have been developed, that have actually been tested, and you are well established in science, that we can use to control locusts and grasshoppers. But the best approach in an open ecosystem is to leave them and to let them be part of the system. In a farming system, we want to manage pests, and we should manage them well. And there are ways of managing them. There is a fungal pesticide that has been developed tested in East Africa and West Africa. It's just a question of changing what's accessible to farmers and making sure that that chemical, that the pesticide is very specific to locusts. This fungus infects them. It doesn't affect other creatures, ants or birds or spiders or other things. And so we should use that kind of technology. But yes, that's a good point. If you're a farmer and a locust swarm arrives, you do want to manage them. But we want to think about, whenever farmers ask me about spraying chemicals, I always say the first question you should ask is this chemical going to kill the pest? Okay. But is it actually going to poison my soil and my water and my family and my pets and my animals? And then we should think differently about how we approach that. Ayesha, you're muted.
Yes, I'm muted. No, I just said thank you. You did touch on the domino effect or the chain reaction, the web. I'm just going to read the second question from Asima before we go to Blaine. Asima said that the buffel grass are so susceptible to intensive fire. How would you go about solving that?
So that's a great question. And I think we have to think about fires both ecologically as well as economically. Bushfires can be very devastating, but fire is actually occasionally part of the grassland ecosystem. There are some ecosystems in Africa that actually benefit from fire. Plants have evolved with the fire. Their seeds need the fire to actually germinate. Now, too many fires too often are very devastating, obviously, but it isn't necessarily just a bad thing. It's just a question of managing it. And traditionally in East Africa, many communities would set fires historically to grasslands to stimulate actual growth, to control ticks, to do all sorts of different things. So fire can be part of the ecology. The question really is that if it's too frequent or if it's done in the wrong way, can be devastating. It is devastating. But if it is there occasionally as part of a broader system, it creates what we call is this mosaic of a landscape, which just creates more opportunities, more productivity for the grasslands and all the species in them.
Thank you, Dr. Martins, and thank you, Asima. There are so many compliments in the chat. I'm not going to touch on them because we've got 10 minutes. So I think I'm going to first go to Blaine. Yeah, Blaine, I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Hi, Doctor.
Hi, Blaine.
Hi. Sorry. I sound a bit congested. I've been sick for a while now. So, sorry, man. While you were answering Asi, you mentioned using sort of a fungi compound to control the locust populations, right?
Yeah.
Would there not be a risk element? Because I'd imagine it's quite sensitive into which environment you'd introduce the fungi into. So would it be very specific? Would you need very specific conditions to make sure that the fungi doesn't actually take over and decimate the locust populations completely?
That's a good point. Typically it doesn't, because it doesn't persist for very long in the ecosystem. So once it's outside in the ecosystem with the sunlight and rain and other things, it very quickly naturally breaks down. But it does help manage locusts at a particular stage of their development, and it often will require a number of treatments in order to be effective. So I think of it as sort of a management tool. And with all the sort of more biological products that we use to control insects, that often is what it is more about, is recognizing and measuring and being intimately familiar with your farm. But if you're a small scale farmer and your crop is threatened, this could be something that could be very effective. And there's even a space for using other chemicals. It just needs to be done the right way. And spraying though over large areas of land, which is what happened with the locust swarms, that is so much more damaging. That kills indiscriminately. It kills bees and birds and fish and frogs, and even larger animals can get poisoned.
Okay. Whereas I suppose a positive with the fungi is that you can kind of target the locusts and the locusts only. Yeah. Okay, awesome. Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you, Blaine.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Blaine. I'm going to read a question from Rajabu Naroro. We can unmute you if you'd like, but I'll read your question. Firstly, thank you for all the information. Would you please share, when do the grasses evolve? A very broad question.
Oh, so that's a great question. Well, like so many things in evolution, we're still trying to understand this. And grasses in Africa grasses as a group evolved quite some time ago. So they've been around for many, many tens of millions of years. But if we think about African grasses and grasslands, really the Miocene is the period of time, which is about sort of 30 up to 5 million years ago, that we see this spread and expansion of grasslands. But there's a lot of debate about their evolution. And right now, because we have the ability to sequence genomes and look at DNA, several scientists are looking at this. So we don't have a perfect answer, but we're starting to piece it together. But we definitely see during this Miocene period, Africa becoming drier and drier, and grasslands spreading and actually becoming the dominant habitat in these parts of the continent. And today, one of the remarkable things is scientists are looking at grasses both in Africa, in Madagascar, and other places. And we don't think of Madagascar as having a lot, we think of it as a rainforest ecosystem, but actually it has a lot of grass diversity, many endemic species, and many insects and other things that evolved to feed on it, including the bamboos, which are fed on by certain lemurs. So we're learning by piecing all these bits and pieces together, but it's a great question. And, if anyone wants to spend a lifetime trying to find an answer, it's a wide open field.
There's an idea to all the TUT students for career path. Thank you, Dr. Martins. I got one more question from Pabala Muhini. Starting with a compliment, thank you so much for a very insightful talk. And then I think you did answer this, Dr. Martins, but they're asking, is there any biological control of locusts alternative to the use of pesticides, as it is crucial to utilize in our habits sustainably? I think that was answered here. Okay, then I'm going to rather go to another question. Herbivory is said to be one of the main drivers of grasslands, and with grass species declining to lower than the average of 100 species per grassland habitat, could that be the reason that declines of grazing herds, such as the Serengeti's wildebeest that you mentioned crossing Kenya?
So I would say we need to think about this in terms of, if we think about why do we need all these species? There's almost 700, there's 700 over 1,000 species of grasses in Kenya alone, over 1,000 across East Africa, many thousands across the rest of the continent and the world. And somebody might be skeptical and say, well, do you really need all of them? Yes, they're pretty and nice to look at, but really we need them because the more species we have, the more interactions we have, the more stability we have in an ecosystem. And so if we think about the change in climate, there are those species that have encountered hot, dry conditions, and we're going to need them in order to continue being able to survive and adapt and be productive. And so I think each species may not be seen in just purely economic value terms right now, but with grasses in particular, if you think about the food we eat, maize or corn, rice and wheat make up almost 70, 80% of the world's diet. All those three are grasses. Sugarcane is a grass as well. And so from this one plant family, we are so dependent on it as an economy. Right now in Kenya, there's a crisis because of the price of food going up. The price of maize and corn in particular is really changing. So we're dependent on these systems. How are we going to adapt and produce in the future? Well, we were going to need all those thousands of species, because the solutions to producing food, to living sustainably, to having nutrition are going to be very much connected to these ecosystems. And the other thing is, as we respond to climate change, and in Africa in particular, as we restore ecosystems, which we can do and we must do, we need all that diversity in order to do it effectively.
Hope that answers your questions, Pavalo. Thank you, Dr. Martins. We don't have much time left, but I need to read this comment to you from Kirsten. She says, I have spent this hour transfixed. And then a big thank you, caps lock.
Thank you,
Dr. Dino, for your wide ecological knowledge and wisdom. I think maybe we can take one more question. There's like a minute left, but let's go for one more question. And this is from David Karanja. How do we go about the effects of land use change of grassland? Is there specific ways we can combine grassland with different land uses?
David, that's a great question. And one of the big challenges in Kenya is the subdivision of land, the quick change of land, and land with biodiversity. Traditional grasslands are not seen as very valuable It's mostly when we change it to agriculture, or what's happening now, changing it to real estate, that we add value. So I think the way to really counter that is to see grasslands themselves as very valuable, that they're also an excellent place as a carbon sink, that they can be productive producing food through livestock or through harvesting other aspects of them. And that if we put in place a good policy, but those policies will only come from people that are informed. So we need to get the message, from share screen to a much wider audience across the continent to really say, look, what's around you is valuable. It's valuable in both real terms, but it's much more valuable for our survival in the future in the continent. So once we value nature, then nature continues to value and support us. Thank you.
I think, yes, thank you. I am just looking for Johan and then CL. Because we've reached the end of the hour, although I feel like this conversation can go on for another hour. There are plenty of compliments and comments in our chat room. So Marit will be forwarding that, or one of us will be forwarding that. Big thank you from myself, from Dr. Cheryl, who's agreeing, and then Johan.
Yes, Dr. Martins, thank you so much. We really, really appreciate your effort in spreading this message, and we will do our best to give it legs.
Thank you so much to all of the students for joining, and especially to all of you, to Aisha, CL, Professor Cheryl, and Johan for giving me the opportunity. Thank you.